Hello and welcome to today's meeting of Democrats of Greater Tucson. My name is Larry Bodine, and I'll be your host today. Let me give an introduction to our speaker today, and that is Priya Sundareshan. She is a law professor at the University of Arizona and the director of Natural Resource Use and Management Clinic. And she's one of these people who appreciates making decisions based on science, especially to preserve the environment. Earlier, she was an attorney for the Environmental Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. And today, she is running for the state senator in the new LD18, and she is advocating for water security through conservation and efficiency, making Arizona a renewable energy leader, protecting our democracy and strengthening voting rights, and improving public education funding and opportunities for all children. And with that, Priya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Larry. And thank you all for having me. I'm very excited to be talking to you as today's speaker. I know I've met many of you, if not at a DGT happy hour previously or elsewhere in the community advocating. So I'm really glad to talk about me and my campaign. So I'm Priya Sundareshan. I'm running for the state senate in the new LD18. So the reasons why I'm running, I have a number of priorities that I would like to address in the legislature. I'm just listing them here, and I'll go into more depth on some of them as I continue talking. But my main priorities are climate change. We have an increasingly urgent crisis with climate change. It's been apparent since the 1990s, and we really just haven't done the work that we needed to mitigate and stop climate change from progressing. And so we're getting to the point where our actions need to be more drastic in order to stave off the worst impacts. And that includes, so some of those actions that we need to take is a rapid transition to renewable energy away from fossil fuels. That is one big aspect of what is contributing to climate change. There's others as well. So it's a kind of whole of society approach, but we have to take whatever steps we can. And there certainly are going to be opportunities, I think, that the state legislature can put forward policies that will help promote renewable energy, promote public transportation, promote agricultural practices that are less contributing to less contributing to greenhouse gas emissions as well, because there are other greenhouse gases besides carbon dioxide that contribute to climate change. So climate change is one of my main areas of interest, and it's an urgent issue. Water as well. Water is something that we are reading about constantly in the news, and we're seeing that our water supplies are starting to dwindle. Climate change is contributing to that. I'll get into a little bit more detail as we continue on that as well. But the Arizona legislature absolutely has a crucial role to play on making sure that our water use does not exceed the amount of water that we have available to us in Arizona. And voting rights. Voting rights is a key issue and one of my key priorities. Of course, we all are aware right now that voting rights are under attack nationally, but also in the state of Arizona, and part of the kind of national angst and the big lie, part of the feeling that a lot of people, certainly not on the Democratic side, but on the right, are claiming that fraud in the elections are an excuse to dial back voting rights and to restrict the right to vote. And that is something that we in the Arizona legislature should not be doing. The legislature should be promoting voting rights. We should be promoting access to the ballot. It should not be suppressing the vote or reducing access to voting. Funding public education. I know that this is an issue that is dear to many people, and I share it as well. And I don't need to. I know there are more highly qualified experts on public education here in the audience, including Lucy Messing. So I won't repeat any facts. But as we all know, Arizona is not funding public education to the levels that it deserves and hasn't been doing so for decades. And as we go through my bio, I'll talk about how even when I was in high school, I recall that we had to be fighting against cuts to funding. And then finally, just as a main priority and something that we're also seeing the Arizona legislature attacking these days is human rights, reproductive justice issues, gender equity issues. These are all fundamental rights that we have as people, as Arizonans, as men and women, as people of all genders, actually. And that's something that the legislature has decided to take it on itself. Again, when I say the legislature, I'm speaking of the Republicans who control the legislature. We all know that they are attacking women's rights. They're attacking the right to an abortion. They're attacking transgender children right now. Truly the most vulnerable people in our society, and passing laws that are going after people's rights to access the healthcare that they need in all of these categories. And so in the legislature, I want to make sure that we are not passing laws that reduce people's access to the healthcare that they need, and that actually affirms their fundamental human rights to be who they are. That's just a kind of brief overview. Now I want to take a step back and talk about who am I, and give you a little bit of background about myself. I was born here in Tucson, right at Tucson Medical Center. And I have to say that it has been a wonderful experience growing up in Tucson. And I think it has shaped who I am as a person and my advocacy priorities as well. I attended schools in the Catalina Foothills School District from third grade until graduation. I had a wonderful experience, and I know that public school experience is not something that is shared by everyone across Tucson, across Arizona, because of differences in the wealth that is available to people in that district. But I think it was a wonderful experience, and I want to make sure that education for Arizonans is funded to the levels that allow everybody in Arizona to have access to the resources and the support that I did. I was definitely a math and science person in high school. When the opportunity came up, I attended Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in Boston, and I studied chemical engineering there. And it was a very hard degree. But it was also a fun time to be in a cohort of students who care a lot about engineering and math and science. But I also, through it all, knew that I had an interest in environmental law and environmental policy. So while I was there, I also minored in environmental policy, and was tentatively thinking about how can I work on environmental issues and make that my career. So I came back to Tucson to join the U of A's law school. And at the same time, I wanted to make sure that nobody that I was trying to get hired with would ever think of asking me to do anything but environmental work. So I also did a dual degree program at the U of A, which I'm so glad that they offered, so that I got a JD at the same time as getting a master's in natural resource economics. And just really wanted to cement that on my resume as I'm here to do environmental law, energy law. Don't tempt me to do any other kind of law. I had internships the first summer with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I learned a little bit about federal utility regulation. The next summer, I interned at the Department of Energy, and specifically their loan guarantee program, which was focused on trying to figure out why we weren't seeing some widespread adoption of renewable energy, and what the government could do to put up the funds, or at least to provide that kind of backing, the insurance backing that would provide extra confidence to people to build these larger renewable projects that could help transition us away from fossil fuels. So that was a very fascinating, both of those were fascinating experiences, fascinating summers. But I also was interested in gaining legal experience from the private sector. So my next summer, I interned at a law firm, and then after graduation, worked at that law firm for 3 years. After 3 years of that, I knew I really needed to do a little bit more in the advocacy realm. I felt like, it's one thing to answer questions that the companies have about how they're supposed to comply with environmental regulations, but it's another thing to be pushing forward for more progressive environmental policy and environmental law. And so I joined a nonprofit in DC called Environmental Defense Fund. It's one of the large environmental nonprofits in the US. About a year later, the Trump election occurred, and suddenly at the federal level, the entire government was controlled by Republicans, which here in Arizona we're no strangers to. But there it was suddenly a crisis mode, and wondering whether our bedrock environmental statutes, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of that could be under attack, and that they might take the opportunity to just completely gut. And so it was an interesting experience lobbying for the federal government. But now I've found so because of the kind of pluses and minuses of that job, I also wanted to come back to Arizona. I knew that there was a huge opportunity, especially politically, to make change. And so I was fortunate to find this opportunity at the U of A, where I teach natural resource law to students as part of my role directing the Natural Resource Use and Management Clinic. Okay, so moving on to I wanted to intersperse a discussion of myself with some facts and some more issue-related discussion. Many of you are probably already aware of a lot of our water issues because we're hearing a lot about it in the news. But some things that I think really exemplify what the Arizona legislature, where the opportunity is, right? Water is at risk in Arizona, but the Arizona legislature has an opportunity to take a look at the way that water law works and can make changes that could fix the issue. So that's what I would like to do. So some of these facts that I think really highlight where we are is that we're experiencing a mega drought. And on top of that, climate change is worsening it. We live in a desert. We're in a drought, so water is already scarce and getting scarcer. And then on top of that, climate change is reducing snowpack in the mountains. And so water just isn't there where we used to have it before. This point is something that I like to start off my discussions when I'm talking to my law students about water law, as something that is just a representation of kind of the lack of science integrated into our law. So groundwater and surface water are treated as two entirely different resources, which the hydrologists will tell you is crazy, because water is groundwater when it's in the ground, but it's surface water when it's above ground. And that water flows between groundwater and surface water simply depending on the conditions and of the ground, of the land that it's on. And so for the law to treat them as completely different resources creates the circumstances for mismanagement, and the long part is, I think, partly to blame for the problems that we're in right now. We also, in Arizona, groundwater is only managed in certain areas. Thanks to the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, we do have management of groundwater. We're not like, what we're often told is the case in Texas, where groundwater is completely unmanaged and it's, just drill as much as you want. There's no backstop on that. At least here in Arizona, we do have management of groundwater, and that was put in place in the 1980s. Unfortunately, that management is only in certain areas, in these groundwater management areas. And those are the Tucson Basin, there's a Phoenix Basin, Pinal has a groundwater management area, and then there's two more up in the northern Arizona. and then there's also something called irrigation non-expansion areas. But beyond that, the rest of the state is completely unregulated. And in those areas, which are really not far outside of the residential Tucson area, as we read about, is it's open for pumping as much as you'd like. And we read about the consequences of that, where we see subsidence of the ground because the groundwater has been the groundwater in the aquifer has been drained. So there's nothing holding up that ground anymore. And the surface of the ground collapses in on itself. And so you see, major sections of highway that have these fissures, and the road is no longer passable and requires construction crews to come out and rebuild the road before it's able to be traversed. So groundwater management only occurs in those areas. Perhaps we can expand the areas in Arizona where groundwater is managed so that we have a more sustainable approach to our groundwater use. Surface water in Arizona, again, treated differently than groundwater. The rights to surface water in Arizona has been adjudicated for about 4 decades, and still to this day, very few of those claims have been resolved. And so there's some, work to do there, and the legislature has been taking a look at what it could do to improve that, provide more resources to the many people who have claims so that they can have legal representation. And there's probably much more that the legislature can do to help with that. Another fact about water in Arizona: the surface water rights are essentially use it or lose it, which means that if someone has a right to use surface water refers to the water that flows above ground, right, in streams and rivers. Those rights are generally use it or lose it. So if you have a right to that water, you have to keep using it every single year. Otherwise, after a period of years, you no longer have the right to that water. And so what that leads to is, even if the circumstances on the ground have changed, and say a farmer who has been using a large quantity of water wants to put in more efficient irrigation practices, they may not feel like they should put in those more efficient irrigation practices, because then they lose the rights to the rest of the water that they had been using. Now, the Arizona legislature did pass a law in the last, I think it was 2020, that addressed a little bit of that use it or lose it kind of mentality, but there's much more to do, and we can incentivize efficiency in the agricultural areas. There's much more efficiency that can be incentivized in the urban areas as well, and we definitely, as part of that, we want to make sure that water is retained in the ecosystem for the trees and the plants and the fish and the animals that rely on it in our riparian areas, which are the areas right by the river systems. And then finally, the final, part of our water puzzle in Arizona is the Colorado River. And we also know right now that it too is being impacted by climate change and reduced snowpack in the Rockies. And so the amount of Colorado River water that we have been used to getting is decreasing. An interesting fact about that is it was allocated amongst the states based on a year of already unnaturally high flow. So we were never really using Colorado River water in a sustainable way ever since it was allocated. I think 1920 or so is when, 1922 perhaps, was when those allocations occurred. And then 1950 was when the lower basin states and Arizona in particular received its lowest priority to the Colorado River water. So that's the reason why we're seeing all these news reports about Arizona having to take these pretty drastic cuts soon. So all of that to say, there's a lot of crisis. There exists a crisis on water issues. We know this because we're reading about it a lot. But aside from the Colorado River allocations, the Arizona legislature should be taking a look at how we're managing groundwater and how we can incentivize efficiency for our water in general so that we are more sustainably managing it. Okay, so a little bit back, stepping back again to my experience and my career in environmental issues, which can really explain why climate change and the environment is such a big focus for me. As I mentioned, I minored in environmental policy and I have a master's degree in natural resource economics. I only say that to underline how important environmental issues have been for me going back, for years. And then I went to DC to practice energy and environmental law, and I gained a very broad base of understanding of different energy issues, including on nuclear regulatory issues, which is at the federal level, very interesting. And then similarly, environmental issues and various statutes that can come into play. And then I, as I mentioned, moved into fisheries advocacy with Environmental Defense Fund. The work that we did there was much more oriented to advocacy with Congress and advocacy with the administration. And as I mentioned, when I joined EDF, it was the tail end of the Obama presidency, and we were all hoping for a Hillary Clinton presidency in which we would be able to advocate for even better protections for the fisheries, as well as, more broadly, all environmental issues. And then, unfortunately, we were disappointed and crushed when the Trump administration came in and Congress was in Republican hands. And suddenly we were in this situation where our most fundamental environmental statutes could be completely overturned. So it was from 2017 to 18 was a constant battle, just trying to mobilize people and speak go meet with staff, go meet with the representatives in Congress, and meet with administration staff members just to work through and minimize the damage. And fortunately, fisheries is one of these areas where we had good partnerships with industry. And so the fishermen generally at this point understood that they needed sustainable fisheries in order for their livelihoods to continue. And that was the result of prior decades of advocacy work that my colleagues had done in talking to the fishermen and bringing them on board to understand and to help advocate with us. Sorry.
Apologies for barging in, but I wonder if you could wrap up on this slide. We've got a number of folks that have questions for you.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I took too long. Okay. Well, all right. So I won't dwell there. I'll wrap up on this slide by saying that I've also continued with my advocacy in a number of different ways. On the environment, testified before the ACC, the Arizona Corporation Commission, on their clean energy rules. I wrote 2 Daily Star op-eds last year urging the chair to vote in favor of those clean energy rules. Unfortunately, the chair, who is from Tucson, Leah Marcus Peterson, she did not vote in favor of the clean energy rules. So that's something that I want to, in the legislature, want to make sure that we are promoting clean energy, whether it's by working with the Corporation Commission or perhaps moving forward in the legislature to promote renewable energy. And then some of you may know the Arizona Democratic Party recently adopted a Go Solar resolution this year. And that was something that I authored and worked with the Democratic Party, state party's environmental council to push forward. I have a picture of me advocating for the Build Back Better Act. So just from a couple months ago, and I hope that we have not completely given up on federal action because we must act now on climate. I'll I guess stop here. I also have done a lot on voting rights and advocacy around voting rights and monitoring and redistricting, including with the wonderful efforts of Susan Bickle, who coordinated the Pima County folks. Just included that picture because that was during the 2018 cycle, but I happened to be wearing my 2010 Giffords shirt. So I was so excited to take a picture with her that day, with Gabby that day. And then what's next for I'll just wrap it up with this. What's next for the campaign? We're knocking doors. Please join us if you can. We're gaining endorsements. I'm happy to have just received Arizona List endorsement. And I'm also endorsed by Kevin Dahl, Tucson City Councilman. And I'm working on, endorsement questionnaires to be able to add more to that list. Also, got to do some work on fundraising. I have pledged not to accept fossil fuel or utility PAC money. I think that's important so that voters know that I am committed to working on climate change, giving it the urgency it needs. And these are my contact information. Okay, with that, Larry, sorry I was going to go forever, but I'm open for questions now.
All right. Well, I could listen to you forever, so it's all good. Let me turn to Craig Markin, who has his hand up. Craig, please unmute yourself and go right ahead.
Yes, hello. Governor Ducey has recently, or just currently, has suggested the idea of desalinization. And since we don't have any salt water, that would probably have to be done in Mexico. It's a highly energy intensive procedure that I understand a reasonable desalinization plant would require one nuclear power plant just to run it. Do you have any opinions on Ducey's stand and your ideas on desalinization?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. I think that is, I agree with the concerns you raised, that it is a highly energy intensive process. I have visited the desalinization plant in Yuma that exists and has been, mothballed. It's not in operation and it would be too expensive to restart. So the idea that, desalinization might provide the answer is a little hard for me to wrap my head around at this point. And I actually would note that Professor Carl Flessa of the University of Arizona recently wrote an opinion piece in the Arizona Republic a few days ago, where he lists a number of the challenges that project would face. So it is not just it's an efficiency question, the feasibility question, but there's also getting Mexico to agree to, putting in money for that, or letting a pipeline come in, or, there's a lot of negotiation that would have to occur for that to be a really workable solution. And it would be no sooner than 5 to 10 years away, which does not really solve our current issues.
Thank you.
All right, let's turn to Joe Danishevsky. I believe there are some questions in the chat, Joe.
Yes, we have a number of questions, and the first one is from Robert Butler. May we hear your views on voting security?
Okay, yeah, I interpret that to mean the combination of making sure that voting is a secure process, that we have appropriate safeguards in place to make sure that that people aren't casting ballots who shouldn't. The thing is, Arizona has very secure elections, and including the 2020 election. The problem, there is no real large widespread fraud problem, as the fraud that occurred for the last year demonstrated. They put tons of money and volunteer work into taking Maricopa County ballots and sifting through them, and they found nothing. Although they found what they were able to do was simply make claims of widespread fraud and perpetuate the big lie. But really, they found nothing, and so I think we can all rest assured that Arizona has a lot of safeguards in place, and our elections are very secure. And instead of trying to use voting security as an excuse to reduce access to the vote, we need to be relying on what we know works, and voting by mail, expanding access to early voting as well. All of those things have a lot of safeguards in place. The signature verification process is but one of many where they make sure that the right person is casting the right ballot.
Okay, the second question from Mary Thiessen. How would you gain Republican support for progressive voting and responsible environmental legislation?
That is a good question. In an ideal world, we flip the legislature and Democrats can run the progressive bills that are needed to really address all of these issues. That's one option. The other option is that we don't flip the legislature. And as you say, we will need to work with Republicans in order to get support for some of this legislation to pass. Now, I'll take water as an example. There are some Republican legislators who represent rural areas that are seeing these impacts of water, water pumping that is completely unregulated, and they are there. And I will certainly call on the experience of my colleague at the law school, Kirsten Engel, who, while she was serving in the legislature, has talked about working with some of those Republicans to try to address the water needs. It will require figuring out which Republicans those are, and maybe amplifying those voices of the rural communities who are being impacted in those districts, so that those legislators know that this is an issue that they need to really be working on. Similarly, for progressive voting legislation, that is a bit tougher. I mean, the Republican Party does seem to have adopted the big lie mentality in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, there are legislators who Republican legislators here in Arizona even, who have repeatedly said that there were not issues with the election. And so, that may be what we need to do, is continue to work with those Republicans to try to at least make sure that the worst of the worst bills and the voter suppression, restricting the access to the vote, doesn't occur. That remains to be seen, but I'll certainly try.
Joe, are there any additional questions in the chat?
Yeah, actually, we have another question from Mary Thiessen. Priya, how do you anticipate your opponents will attack you and your priorities, and how will you respond?
How do I anticipate my opponents will attack my priorities? Well, speaking, I think these priorities, if we're talking about Republican opponents, these priorities are unfortunately not necessary, although they are, I think, fact-based, and it's clear that these priorities do need to be addressed. I'm not sure that all Republicans share those similar facts. For example, not everyone agrees that climate change is an urgent issue that needs to be addressed, and certainly on the Republican side, we find a lot less support for that kind of set of facts. But all I can do is continue to emphasize the facts and point to the experts. And here in Arizona, we have a lot of experts who know a lot about the environmental crises that we face, climate change and the water and all of that. And just trying to elevate their voices, I think would be a big priority.
All right, we've got a question from Steve Linder, our treasurer. Go ahead, Steve.
Right, thank you. And here, Priya, this is my Giffords 2010 shirt.
Nice.
I'm proud of that too, so I have it. Actually, Joe went ahead and asked my question. My question has always been, in reality, how can you deal with a Republican-controlled legislature where the frustration is trying to talk to these people and knowing that most likely it's even heading more and more right in the people who are running for office? And how can you deal with this and get things done? And you kind of answered that with Joe, but if you have anything more to expand on that, that's really what I'm interested in.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think just to build on that previous answer, there are areas of common ground that it's possible to find if you can do it. And I'll go back to my experience with Environmental Defense Fund, where we were successful on preventing the worst cuts to the sustainable fisheries laws, because we had our partners in the fishing industry who were bought in, and those fishermen are not liberal fishermen at all. And so their advocacy and their involvement was very useful and helpful in talking to the Republicans who they were constituents of. And so that kind of common ground and coalition building is very vital. And I would probably need to lean on that kind of work.
Okay, we have another question from Barbara Warren. Go right ahead, Barbara. Unmute yourself.
Hi, I wanted to know what your position is on the safety and efficacy of nuclear power, and how we can be sure that we avoid our Fukushima. And are you a supporter of the Palo Verde, or can we do something about Palo Verde?
Hi, Barbara. Thanks. I think that, having had experience at the law firm working on nuclear regulatory issues, I was given an insight into the very heavily regulated role that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission plays, and they need to be continuing to play that role. We need to have aggressive oversight, and we need to have stringent security and safety standards. And I recall I joined the firm just after Fukushima, that the NRC had, after that accident occurred, added to the security and safety regulations that they required all of the U.S. plants to meet and maintain. So I think that making sure that we have very strong oversight is how we need to continue to treat our nuclear power plants. I also do want to look at it from the bigger picture, that climate change is a threat, and it's real, and we have a large energy demand. And so until we can, and we will, emphasize energy efficiency and reduce our energy demand, that nuclear power, that as it exists, will continue to play some role in that transition to more renewable energies. And I think we also can look at some of the newer technology, and again, making sure that the safeguards are all in place to ensure that they're safe and secure. But we can look at the small reactors as well, and make sure that as long as the safety issues are met, then we must use them as part of a way to take us off of coal and gas, which are continue to be part of a too big of a part of our fuel mix.
Thank you for that. Let's turn to Sylvia Lee, who has a question. Go ahead, Sylvia.
Thank you. I just want to endorse Priya. I'm the former chair of the Arizona Democratic Party's Asian Pacific Islander Caucus. And last year, Priya took over the chair. And prior to that, during the 2020 election, she was the voter advocate and really helped increase the Asian vote in the state of Arizona. And I believe really had a big role to play in increasing the Asian vote for Biden. And I just want to make sure everyone knows that besides all the wonderful things that she's done and talked about, she's also very involved at a state level with the party and also with the Asian Democratic Caucus.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, I ran out of time to mention that. It's been a great opportunity to mobilize the Asian American community and taking the good work that you had done to organize the community and move it forward, because there's a real opportunity.
Okay, let's turn to Michael Desantis, who has a question. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi, Priya. Thanks for being here today first. It's really great to hear your thoughts. From a legal perspective, do you see any openings coming as the water situation is expected to get nothing but worse in Arizona? I've seen this firsthand, being in the water industry. Do you see any opening forming yet around addressing that use it or lose it laws and these archaic laws, many of them that go back to mining period, and that are really destroying, sustainable water policy in the southwestern United States? Do you see any cracks in that yet, or any openings?
I think that's something that I'll have to learn as I go about the opportunities to fix it, and the let's say the receptivity of others to really addressing the root of the problem, which go back decades, centuries, as you just mentioned. I hope so, and I hope that the more we talk about it, the more energy there is around addressing the root of those problems. Certainly the use it or lose it, I had an asterisk there because there was a law in 2020 that was passed that did carve out a small exemption for conservation use. So the use it or lose it abandonment did not apply in certain specific situations for conservation. And so I think, with that kind of, that demonstrates that there's a foot in the door and an interest in trying to take some of those hard questions, and whether we can revamp the system entirely may be a big question given all of the interests that are now built up around it. But I would hope so, and I hope that we can continue to talk about it.
Susie, did you have a question?
There was an article about an outfit that wanted to put a wind farm up in Pinell County, but it discussed very clearly the fact that we don't have wind in the winter, at least not sustainable, predictable winds in that, in much of Arizona. What about turning that into solar? I know a lot of them talk about, the problems with the environment that's there and that it should be left as is, but would solar impact as much as the wind farm?
Without knowing the detail, I think that's a great question, and I love the fact that there are people thinking about using land in that way, especially land that was former farming land that is no longer able to be irrigated. I especially love talking about putting renewable energy projects on areas that have already been disturbed, that are not the the open desert areas where we have the ecology is still there and the animals use as corridors. I'd much rather see projects go on disturbed land and land that's been used for other purposes already. So I'm very hopeful. I think you mentioned some of the problems, Susie, that they're facing, and so it's very likely that solar might be a better option for those developers to look at. But I don't know the specifics of what they're using to calculate their costs and benefits. But I'm very encouraged by hearing that story.
Okay, Priya, I think that's it for questions. Tell us how we can support you and how we can find out more about you.
Here's my website at the very least, and feel free to get in touch. And I would love for, folks to help volunteer. We've got to knock on a bunch of doors in order to reach voters before the primary. And if you're able, we'd love to have you to join us. If not, we also welcome fundraising support. So please help out. I would really appreciate it. Thanks so much. And also your vote. I would love your vote.
All right. Thank you so much for coming to Democrats of Greater Tucson. With that, I'll have to bring the meeting to an end, and we'll see you at the meeting on next Monday. Thanks so much for coming today. Bye-bye.